afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Maggie Mahan, the Assistant Director for Community Engagement with the State Historical Society of Missouri, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you to today's session. Thank you so much for joining us as the Associate Director of the Cape Girardeau Research Center, Bill Eddleman, presents the fourth installment in his Beginning Genealogy Workshop series. Today's program focuses on finding and using vital records. If you need to catch up on the first three parts of the series or would like to rewatch any of the segments, you can view them on demand on the State Historical Society of Missouri's website at shsmo.org. All events in our virtual programming series are made possible thanks to the generous support of the State Historical Society of Missouri's members and donors. Please visit our website at shsmo.org to learn more and see how you can add or renew your support. Thanks again for joining us. I will turn things over to Bill. Bill, welcome and thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Maggie. Welcome everybody, and so glad that you're here for the fourth installment in this series. Today we're going to talk about a key piece of information for those interested in genealogy and family history, and that's the components of vital records and how you find those. So first of all, I want to talk about what a vital record is. A vital record is, according to Wikipedia, a record of a life event kept under governmental authority that includes birth certificates or birth records, marriage licenses or certificates, and death certificates. Genealogists usually add divorce records to that list. Why are these important for us as genealogists? First of all, they'll place your ancestor in a time and place and location, which allows you to do further research, or maybe allows you to reject records that are a person of the same name but not your ancestor. They allow determination of errors, and a lot of times you'll get multiple dates pointed to from different sources. If you have an actual record that occurred contemporary with the event, that's your ultimate source and will allow you to determine which other records might be erroneous. They assist us with sorting out people of the same name because of different ages, different locations, and so forth, and lead to further research possibilities. Also, many people do genealogy in order to attain membership in lineage societies. And one of the things that lineage societies ask for specifically is vital records. And many people want to fill those blanks in, so it's time to research vital records to do that. Before we go any farther, I want you to think about a few things. There's some preliminary things when you study vital records that you need to be aware of first. The first thing is you need to know the state and its laws for the time period you're interested in. Many states, many people get into genealogy and think, oh, there's birth and death certificates back till 1750 or whatever. Well, many states really didn't require vital records be recorded until the 20th century. Missouri is a good example. 1910 is the cutoff. And you can get at that with the link I've given you to go farther. Always be aware of why and how the record was generated. Very few of these records were generated so that you could determine your ancestor's birth or death date. There was some other reason why they were generated. Also, you need to know who prepared it, because a lot of times that allows you to evaluate the record better, and also who provided the information. There's no neat and tidy place to go for all vital records. Many people want to go to one spot. I'll go to Ancestry and I'll find it. Sorry, it's not all there. State information varies over time. Information varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, from state to state, from municipality to municipality in some cases, and the sources may vary over time. So you go to one source if it's earlier, another source if it's decades later or 100 years later. Think about what you really need. A lot of people get obsessed with getting that exact date, and these are great. It's wonderful to have exact dates, but sometimes for many purposes, a date range or approximate date will get you what you want. For example, with DAR, if you can't find an exact date, they'll accept a range or an approximate date in many cases. So make sure you're not going to obsess over something you don't need to obsess over. A little bit about the history of vital record recording. It goes way back in many states. Massachusetts, for example, had town registers starting in 1626 and very sporadic at the time. By 1841, Massachusetts established registers as a mandate from the state level. Generally, New England, the other states in New England have the earliest vital records along with Massachusetts. Most states began recording these in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But oftentimes you'll see, depending on the county, a lot of times, or the town, there may be prior efforts that will give you the same information and that they required at the local level. Typical pattern was it would be required by the state or a town or a county, but enforcement initially would be very lax. So just because your ancestor doesn't have a birth certificate or a death certificate doesn't mean they weren't there. It may mean that they just didn't bother and nobody forced them to do it. There's considerable variation in availability to genealogists. That's kind of changing, and I'll talk about Missouri's situation there. But usually death records are older than a certain date, and marriage records are accessible, but birth records are oftentimes restricted. That is, at a certain time, they generally assume that most people that have died have no more use for a right to privacy, or there's no chance of fraud in their estate, so they open up death records. Birth records, though, are oftentimes restricted for a long time, even well after the person might have died. Marriage records are accessible because they are a public record, and typically at the county level. Principal birth records, and we'll talk about birth records first. First of all, they're birth certificates, state registration is that level. There are delayed birth certificates. Many people had to get those in order to receive Social Security back in the 1930s and 40s. They were born well before the requirement, but they needed documentation of birth. Public recording of births, some options there. Sometimes you can get birth date from a census. In 1850 to 1940, you can get an approximate birth date from the age. The month for infants in 1870, that is born in the previous year, so you get at least the month and year. And then the month year in 1900 was specifically recorded. Tax lists give you an indirect measure of birth, particularly for males. Depending on the tax list and the jurisdiction, they had to be 16 or 21 in order to be taxed. So you have, if they appear and you know that maybe they were there ahead of years before that, you know they turned 21 or 16. And then naturalization records are another birth record. Here's a birth certificate. And this is a typical birth certificate with all the information. Gives the parents the gender of the child, their date of birth, where the event was recorded, and where it happened, and then a statement from the attending physician. And some of these, you'll notice I got this one from Ancestry. Some are on Ancestry for some states. You just have to use the card catalog and search. Missouri did not require, as I've mentioned before, recording of births and deaths till 1910, but there was a state law passed in 1882 that supposedly mandated birth and death recording. There was no enforcement. It was really sporadically enforced. And so there's a lot of people that got missed. But if you need that pre-1910 birth information, it's available on the State Archives website. Something else in Missouri that just came online relatively recently is from Reclaim the Records. It's an organization that their main goal is to require entities that recorded births and deaths and other vital records to actually release the information, because a lot of times there's really no legal mandate to restrict the information. Missouri was sued by Reclaim the Records a few years ago and lost the case. And so they had to turn over birth information through 2015 to the organization, which took a while to process it and get it online, but it's up there now, and the link is on your handout. But the birth index kind of looks like this. This is the splash page. It's the search, some search boxes where you can look for surnames or given name, surname with middle initial, and then you can narrow the birth date. So I'm searching for myself here. And lo and behold, I'm in here. But you'll also notice it goes, this particular screen, there were William Eddlemans who were born as recently as 2015 who are there. So delayed birth certificates, here's an example. And people had to bring in proof of the birth date. And a lot of times that proof was a little, I think, a little squishy. In this case, supposedly it was in a family Bible, and apparently they did bring in the family Bible. But a lot of times they would just take, if the mother were still alive, they'd just take the mother's word for it as to the birth date. And so you had to present multiple pieces of information. So you've got an affidavit, in this case from the mother, marriage application for the individual who were the parents, and petition for initiation into an organization, and then also the family Bible page. So this is a typical one. They may have more or less information, and you can again find some of those on Ancestry. Interestingly enough, I always say you should always look. There were actually counties in Kentucky that had birth registers that date back to the 1850s. And here's an example from Allen County, Kentucky, which, when you think about it, we've always kind of thought Missouri and Kentucky were kind of on par with how they did things in early days, but Kentucky was recording births back in the 1850s, but it's only for certain counties. So if you're lucky enough, you might find it there. Here's an example of an individual who first appeared on the 1835 tax list, Austin Fulbright. I happen to know about this individual. He actually did turn 21 this year. I've looked at his tombstone and verified that, but he appeared on this tax list for the first time in 1835, which would put his birth year as about 1814. Individuals who were immigrants, who were non-citizens and then naturalized, had to list their birth date on their naturalization papers. And so that's another place to go for birth date. Right, next we'll talk a little bit about marriage records. First of all, there are civil registers. Some examples are intentions to marry, which actually are church records, applications in some jurisdictions, depending on the laws and depending on the jurisdiction, marriage bonds, consent forms, licenses, returns and registers, and certificates. And depending on the jurisdiction, you may have a whole process that generates up to 3 different documents before someone got married. So for example, I know in Missouri and places, there was a license issued, there was an application before the license, and then oftentimes the minister or the justice of the peace would bring in a return or a copy of the register that they kept. So you'd have 3 different records for a marriage. Survival of all of these may not have occurred, though. You may have 1 or 2, or may have all 3. So the return, register, or certificate have the actual date. A lot of times you have to be careful about returns, because a lot of times they turn them in as a bundle. They go into the courthouse periodically, and the justice of the peace would turn in a bundle of them, and they may not have the right date. Approximate, but not exact. Some church records, the only marriage record you may get are banns. These are, the couple would announce in church, typically 2 or 3 times, depending on the church we're talking about, that they intended to get married. And when they did the final announcement, they were considered to be married because it was in front of the congregation. Those are a little harder to get at because they involve finding church records. You can also get at marriage records, marriage dates from the census. So 1850 to 60, unless they were married within the year, you'll get indirect evidence of the marriage. Typically, there might be a child that has a certain age, the oldest child, and you can kind of approximate the marriage year from that. In 1870, if they were married within the previous year, they had to list the month they were married. And then in 1900 to 1910, they had to list the number of years they were married. You'll also get this sometimes from newspapers, either when the event occurred or when an anniversary party might have occurred. A marriage bond, which some states required these, and I guess jokingly, I've heard these referred to as insurance, that the groom would actually go through with it, but the prospective groom had to post a bond to guarantee that the marriage would occur. So a lot of times that bond was so large that the groom would have to get some of his friends or relatives to help kick in the money. If he didn't go through with it, skipped town, didn't get married for whatever reason, the bond was forfeited. These are not marriage dates. A lot of times the bond would be filed and it might be weeks before the marriage occurred. So where you get these are pretty interesting things to look at. You can also investigate some of the bondsmen to see if they were relatives, and it may give you additional information. There were registers kept, and this is an example here that I love. If you ever do research in Illinois and some other states, Illinois in the early 1870s started to require this register information, and it's really great because it not only gives the parties getting married and the date, it gives their address, it gives their occupation, it gives their parents' names and the witnesses, and how many times the people have been married. So in this case, this was for a client I was supposed to find the parents of Charles Carroll, and he actually was Charles Caron, French, came off as Carroll when the clerk wrote it down. And so this confirmed the parents, Louis Caron and Anna, actually, I believe it was Catherine Caron. So, and that it was his second marriage, and that he was born in St. Francis County, Missouri. So if you're lucky enough to have people getting married in that time period in Illinois up to about 1910, you'll get all this wonderful information. Next are divorce records, and divorce records are typically not a separate register or anything, and you may not get the exact date. What you're going to get is a court record because they had to go to court. And I'm always amazed, a number of these, they actually would go to court and go through the process and then not do it. And this is an example. There's no actual date confirmed for this couple getting divorced, but there's lots of juicy information about them in the court case. So you find these in court records. If there was a decree, it meant that that's the date of the divorce. Some of these in early Missouri, I know, went to the Supreme Court, and you can find it on the State Archives database. Attempt to find the loose case papers and bundles, because that'll give you the details. But you're going to have to also remember, unless something was really egregious, divorce was rare in until the last 100 years or so. Also check newspapers, because there might be an indication there that there was a divorce. Death records include death certificates. They're wonderful if we can get them. You also get the birth date off a death certificate, although it's a little bit more questionable than a birth certificate date. And in Missouri, there's a 50-year moratorium. They're now indexing the 1970 death certificates for Missouri, and they should be out probably around April, I would think. There's also a cause of death code that you may find valuable, and there's a link to look at those cause of death codes, and I'll talk about those in a minute. And then also there's mortality schedules that give at least the month, if not the date and month of death. And those are available for Missouri on this Missouri State Archives website under the Census and Tax records. So let's look at a death certificate in a little bit of detail. We'll look at one later when we evaluate it. But here's one that actually solved something for a client of mine, because apparently the client could not read the script because the answer to her question was right there. And she was wondering the relationship between this elderly lady and her ancestor, David Cook. It turns out they were mother and son. So when I interpreted and read the actual text, she died from senility and old age. There were no medical attendants, love the way medical spell, for the reason that the physician last in attendance said she needed none. I am her son and have been with her all the time. And that was documentation also for the relationship. Very interesting story on this lady I'd love to talk about, but I don't have enough time today. The codes that I mentioned, and again, here it was 154, which actually was senility. These are codes that were widely used on death certificates. They were periodically revised. So this National Classification of Disease, you have to use the codes that were in force at the time of death. So you need to look down the line and figure out, you can see the years here. If you try to interpret a code using, and the death happened in 1930, and you're using the 1893 codes or the 1900 codes, you may make a mistake. So make sure you're using the one in force at the time. There are also pre-1910 death records. It's the same database as the birth records I talked about in Missouri. So you can go look at those as well. And these had a variety of levels of detail depending on what the clerk wrote down and what the people told them. This actually is my great-great-grandmother, and I know she died, I know exactly where she died in Randall Township now, and that she died of carcinoma of the stomach. So there's the link for that. It's also on your handout. This is a searchable database, and the legislation, they finally gave up in 1893 on the birth and death recording in Missouri because it was not being complied with. And so the General Assembly repealed it in 1893. So don't consider these by any means complete. And by the way, don't consider it accurate. The birthplace for her is absolutely wrong. It was Jackson County, Ohio. Then here's an example of a mortality schedule. This is my great-great-grandfather. In this case, he died in 1880, and he died of pneumonia in March of 1880. And it was the previous year, so it went from June 1879 to end of May 1880. So this was March 1880 that he died. Some of these are on Ancestry for some states, others are not. For Missouri, you're going to get the whole thing, image and everything, on the State Archives website. And they're searchable by name. And again, here we are back in Allen County, Kentucky. They also kept death registers from the 1850s on. This particular one was from 1904. Just happened to pull this one out in pretty good detail where you can find them, where they did bother to record them. There's other records you can use as indirect evidence or approximate dates for death. One is funeral cards. These were typically distributed around town when someone died and they were going to have a funeral, and maybe the newspaper only came out weekly or there was no newspaper. They distribute these around town at places where people might congregate. And they're good indication that the person died sometime shortly before October 21st. Unfortunately, the year's not given. Probate and will records are indirect. Typically, people would file for letters of administration on an estate very quickly after the death of an individual. Although that is not 100% true, it's probably 98% true. Funeral home records are good if the funeral home's still around or if the successor's still around. So you can use that. Here's a probate administrative bond dated the 7th of October, 1793. So John Wills, I believe this was, John Wills, died probably shortly before the 7th of October, 1793, because his letters of administration on his estate were let out to these gentlemen shortly thereafter. There is also more up-to-date death information because of the Reclaim the Records lawsuit for Missouri. We'll have death certificates through 1970, which gives all the detail, but you can, if you just want a date, I just searched for my surname and I got a ton of hits on up in well beyond the cutoff date of 50 years. And here you have it. A general vital records link that I want to point out for all of these different types of vital records is Joe Bynes' site. And it's not all states, it's just some states, but he has tons of links to nationwide vital records. So this is a good one to check out. It's organized by state. You can click on state genealogy guides and online records, and here's the list of states that are included. And if you go there, you'll get the same list of states. Missouri happens to be one of them. Here's a transcribed funeral home book, and it gives birth and death dates in this case, and also relationships. Those will vary depending on what the funeral home recorded. So it may just be a list of names and dates. It may in some cases just be names to more complete information. And these may have been passed on to businesses that bought out that funeral home or took it over. They may have been passed on to a local archives or museum. So you should always check to see if there were funeral home records. To do that, you'll have to go to a local society, archive, museum, or library. There's some records that have multiple vital records contained right inside the record. So in this case, this is a baptismal record from a church record, and it gives the birth and baptism dates for Maria Julia Dorai. And then also, here's a death date, gives the age, so you can extrapolate the birth year for this individual. And you've also got the parents listed. Doorway was a fun surname to try to it's French, and so I think I found 14 different spellings by the time I was done with all the records. The newspaper articles will oftentimes give you multiple vital records. So here's an obituary for George Owenius Sr., and it gives his age, and it says he'd been a resident of the town since 1854, was in the Civil War, and this also gives you the church where the funeral was held, so you might look for church records as well. And I do want to talk about cemeteries because in this series, this is the most appropriate place to talk about it. So a lot of people really seem to obsess on finding their ancestors' burial place. And I want to kind of, if you're just getting into this or not terribly experienced, I want to cushion you a little bit from the blow that may come. The farther back we go, the lower the percentage of marked graves, unfortunately. And why is that? Well, people were not rich. It cost money to buy a marker. And so many people just put up a rock or a wooden cross or something like that. And they may remember where their relative was buried, their loved one. But then when they move away or pass on, the knowledge passes away and we don't know who's buried there. Also, if you have Quaker ancestors, it was thought to be ostentatious to mark a grave for many, many decades early in Quakerism, so they're not marked. You also got to think, what's the source of information on the marker? If the marker was placed many years later, it may be totally off. And I'll give you an example here in a minute. Nonetheless, cemeteries are the most endangered genealogical resource. So most jurisdictions don't care for abandoned ones, despite what people think. I get irate people all the time saying, well, why doesn't the county take care of this cemetery? Because people don't want their taxes raised to pay for things like that. So they don't care for it. It's really a lot of trouble to care for cemeteries. You can find them on maps. You can find online directions and locations from local groups and residents. Funeral home personnel are really good sources for cemetery locations, aerial images, and assessors' offices and maps. So I found the cemetery. What do I do now? Well, you look at some of this stuff and you think, oh, that's kind of creepy. Somebody's taken a shovel to a cemetery. Well, a lot of times what you find is the markers turned over. I use this probe to find those markers. If they're deeper than a foot, I'm not going to find them. But if I find one that's buried, I have to get it out. And so a shovel's the most handy tool to use very carefully. You'll see what some of these other things are used for here in a minute. So I find the cemetery. How do I take home the information I find? Well, the most common way is transcription. It doesn't damage the stones. It's the most often used, but it is subject to transcriptional error and reading error. Photography is great if the stone is legible, and I'll show you some ways to make it more legible and some to not use to make it more legible. Gravestone rubbings, again, if the stone is in good shape. Aluminum foil casting, again, if it's in good shape. And I want to show you the way I use to read stones. It typically requires an assistant. I've done this by myself with I have a little prop on the back of a full-length mirror that allows me to do this. But the stone in question is the one that's lit back in the background. The picture on the left is the same stone without the lighting. The one on the right is with very steep angle, reflected sunlight using a mirror. I can't read it very well on the left. I can read it perfectly well on the right. So a lot of people will tell me something's illegible, and it really isn't if you shine a light on it the right way. Light makes a big difference in light angle. Another alternative is to take that container of water, which you take with you to the cemetery. You can use distilled water if you're concerned about possible stone damage, or rainwater. And take that soft bristle brush, pour a little water, rub it across the stone, and it will deposit dirt in the lettering and make it more legible. I couldn't read this very well until I did this, and it's a broken stone, child stone. So plain water and a soft brush. If you still can't read it, you can use a bag over the stone, plastic bag, and then a flashlight or just a strong flashlight to shine across the face. You can also use aluminum foil covered cardboard or mylar to serve as a mirror if you're concerned about breaking a mirror. You can use a 12-inch tube to focus down on certain letters while you're doing this as well. It will throw them in shadow and then shine a flashlight across, and you can read one letter or number at a time. Here's a couple things that I tell you not to use, and stone conservators will tell you not to use to read gravestones. On the left is shaving cream. I cringe when I hear shaving cream because it contains chemicals that for some stones will actually deposit on the stone and stay there and promote faster weathering. Now, if it's granite or something like that, probably not. If it's limestone, possibly. If it's slate, possibly. So I just don't use it. On the right is chalk, and same thing. If you're putting chalk on something, a lot of people say, oh, the rain washes it away. Not all of it. Particularly if it's like this. This was pink chalk. It probably stayed on there for a year or so, if I had to guess. It's dye. Also be aware of the way letters and numerals weather. So here's a 1 and a 4, and they're going to weather pretty much the same. When they're weathered down, you're just going to have a vertical straight line. But look at the spacing. A 4 is going to have more space. It's also not going to typically be the leading numeral unless it's in an age. So here's an example. The death date here was the 3rd of January, 1841. Many people might read this as 1811 and think this was a child, but no, it was an adult. 7s and 8s weather this way. You'll have, for 7s, you'll have a horizontal line and then kind of a slightly off-kilter vertical line. An 8, because the carving is strongest across the middle, going from upper left to lower right, you'll end up with that as the last surviving piece. 2s, 3s, and 5s, you have to look to see where the dots are because of the way the stone carvers carve those numerals. 2s have 1 dot upper left, 3s have 2 dots, and 5s have 1 dot lower left. 6s, 9s, and O's. O's will have 2 vertical curved lines. 9s will have a complete vertical curved line and a half vertical curved line on the upper left. 6s will be vertical curved line on the left and then a partial one on the lower right. Some other things to consider when transcribing: record only data on the stone. Any other information should go in comments. This is my biggest problem, and I'll say this again later, with Find a Grave. Record in natural order, not alphabetically, because natural order will give you family groups sometimes. Record data on the stone, what's it made of, what kind of conditions it's in, and so forth. What shape is it? And I construct a map for smaller cemeteries, even if it's a rough sketch map. A little bit about Find a Grave compared to Billion Graves. most people use find a grave. Billion graves actually, in some ways, is superior. But first of all, why were they developed? Find a grave, it's a hobby of a person that liked to visit celebrity cemeteries, and it grew from there. And then billion graves actually was developed for genealogists. It gives you GPS, geographic positioning system locations. Locations vary in quality for find a grave. I actually was over in Kentucky and thought I'd found a cemetery, found out that there were two cemeteries with the same name. Somebody had put the wrong photographs with the wrong cemetery, and so I missed the one I was wanting to find. And I tried to get people to correct that, and they won't listen. Cemeteries have GPS locations for billion graves. Images, not all the markers have images, and people stick stuff in that doesn't belong in a cemetery oftentimes in Find a Grave, and all markers are recorded with images in billion graves. The reason people go for Find a Grave is numbers. It's far larger than billion graves. And the mission is, on Find a Grave, it's really to post memorials, remembrances, and virtual flowers. For billion graves, it's to provide accurate gravestone data. So if you find an ancestor in billion graves, trust it more than Find a Grave. But if you just find them in Find a Grave, that's what you got. Here's an example of one I recorded in Find a Grave. This is only information that was on the stone, period. That's all I do. Here's one of my ancestors that somebody else recorded, and they put a whole bunch of other garbage on there, much of which is in error. The birthplace, the parentage, the mother's name is wrong. We don't know for sure that those are the children. There's just all sorts of erroneous information here. I don't know what his middle initial was either. It may not have been J. The only information on the tombstone was Jacob Fulbright, birth date, death date, period. And the stone on the lower left is the original stone. There's a newer stone that was placed with the same information on the grave as well. And we don't know for sure from the stone information if that was indeed the spouse. I know it is, but it's not on the stone. The issues I have with Find a Grave, people can't resist being helpful. Cemetery I take care of, Fulbright Cemetery, this William Joseph Drum was recorded in there. He's not in there. He's buried on his land, about 6 miles away. The reason they put him in here is his wife's really buried in here. And so you've got this problem that, again, people won't get rid of them when you ask them to. So I'm stuck with this when people ask about it. Some contributors think it's a competition. They want to get all the names they can and Find a Grave. And it gets to be impossible to correct. Here's a billion graves example. And again, good information, shows you the location, photograph of the stone. It's only the stuff that's on the stone. You can also get this information from cemetery or sextant records. What you don't want to assume is that there are cemetery records for everything. Most family plots and old churches, they don't exist. They're gone, or they never existed in the first place. If it was a large cemetery, they might exist somewhere. Seems like more than often than not, I find out they were consumed by fire at some point. All right, another multiple vital record source is diary entries. This is a diary from Perry County, Missouri. This individual, who was actually a distant relative of mine, distant cousin, loved to record when his neighbors died and when they had babies. So bless him for that. Everything I've ever found that I could verify is right on the mark. He was pretty accurate with his recording. He didn't record much though, not a whole lot of detail, but it's there. So if you got a diary from the area, check it out. Bible records. One big caution with Bible records is to pay attention to the handwriting and the type of ink, because it indicates either everything was written once, if it's all identical ink and handwriting, or things were added at different times if it differs. So here's an example where the first two entries look like they were entered at the same time, but then there's another entry at the bottom that was definitely entered later and probably contemporary to the event. So you got to be aware of that because there can be errors. The main challenge with Bible records is finding them. There are a variety of websites you can Google, but a lot of them are still in family hands. Some are in local historical societies or manuscript collections as well. So there's one website where you might find them. Most of the ones I need to find, I've seen mention of, and nobody knows where they are now. There's another one. Then you have the mug books, which are local histories that have local biographies. Typically, these were published by outfits like Goodspeed Publishing, and they were done by subscription. So if you gave money, were a subscriber, you could have the biography placed in the book. So you know your ancestor had a copy of the book because they subscribe to it if they have a biography in the book. This is still being done today, different companies. They're notorious for inaccuracies, but a lot of times they're good, and a lot of times they provide good clues. You can use a search engine to find them for different areas. Some areas had a Goodspeed's history, some didn't. Some were other outfits, some were locally funded and produced. So a lot of these are available on Hattie Trust and some of the other book websites because they're older than 90 years old and they've been scanned in. State Historical Society has most of these for Missouri, if not all, in the library in Columbia. Another source for vital records is passports, and some of these are on Family Search. Here's an example. These will give you birth dates and a lot of times relatives' names. Approximate birth date you can infer from yearbooks. People tended to be 15, 16, 17, 18, depending on what class they were in. There, more and more yearbooks are coming up online all the time. Some you can find on Ancestry, some are on yearbook sites. Social Security Death Index is available on Family Search. These are for people that, of course, have died since Social Security was implemented, and they'll give you birth and death dates oftentimes. This is one of my uncles. Military records can give you birth dates because people had to register. In this case, this is a registration record. This is my grandfather. So draft registrations. There are two sides to this, and so you should always look at the reverse side as well. It may have additional information. Also look at enlistment documents, pension files, interment records. Here is an enlistment paper from fold 3. Gives the person's age. One time I was giving a program on Civil War, finding Civil War records, and on fold 3. And I said at the end, if anybody, it was a small audience, I said, anybody want me to look anybody up? And a lady said, well, I've had this ancestor that I know served in this unit, and I just haven't seen his service record. So I looked it up, and this particular page came up, the company descriptive book, and it had the man's birth village in Switzerland on it. The woman just about fell out of her chair. She'd been looking for that for decades, and there it was. So not only vital records, but other information too. Pension records will give you age, and thus you can infer birth year, but also If you've got the entire pension record with the final payment voucher, it will give you the death date. And those are available on Full 3 for Revolutionary War pensions. This is James McElroy. He died on the 9th of February, 1848, and left no widow. So I know his wife was dead by that date as well. And it gives his birth date, 21st of September, 1759, in other papers in the pension application. For many military individuals who served in the military, there will also be an interment report. And these are available on Ancestry. And here's an example of one. Obituaries are a great place to find birth and death dates. Remember, they're secondary sources, though. They're not, they're derivative. So take them with a grain of salt and verify them, but usually they're pretty accurate, especially modern obituaries. Also, a word about obituaries. If you go before 1900, an obituary for most individuals was a rare event. You're not going to find them. People had to just basically send the information to the paper, and most relatives didn't do that. So people look for obituaries expecting to find one, and it is a pretty rare event, although you should always look. So free and subscription services have searchable collections of obits. Newspapers oftentimes have obituary archives. All right. As I mentioned, you should always look critically at any of these records. Never take them at face value. Always think about where this information come from, how likely is it to be accurate, and how does it match up with other records that I've seen. Here's my maternal grandfather's death certificate. So the first thing I'm going to look at is, this is great-grandfather, Giles. The first thing I'm going to look at is who was the informant. Well, if I go down to informant, it says W.D. Devers. I know that he was a son of Giles, so he was the informant. Also note the handwriting. It differs in different sections. If it's all the same on the entire document, be suspicious. It should always look a little different in the part that the doctor was supposed to fill out, obviously. But in this case, to me, it looks a little slightly different down in the informant line. But always look at that. Note the handwriting. Is it the same? Is it not the same? Compare the date of the event to the date of record. Sometimes there was quite a delay. In this case, date of death was the 31st of March. The doctor had attended him since January 1932 is the year. So we know how long he was ill. And this was filed on the 1st of April. So pretty quickly, within a day after the death in this case. So if I see a big gap there, you should be suspicious, perhaps, of the information. What information is missing? Well, in this case, the only thing that's missing is, was there some other external cause or evidence for death? And for most people, that should be missing unless they were, sick with something and then fell and hit their head, in which case that should be filled in. Are there any codes, and what do they mean? In this case, nephritis, this is dead on for nephritis, 132. So it matches the written out cause of death. How does the record fit with the laws of the time? Well, to do that, you have to know the laws of the time, and it required death certificates, and they were kept in sequence in different counties, and it appears to be okay in that regard. So I'm not going to question that. Here's another example. The previous guy's father-in-law, actually. And I look at some of the things there. William Honnebrink, okay, he was actually a son-in-law. And he was living with that son-in-law at the time of his death, according to his obituary in the paper. So that kind of fits. If I look at the handwriting, it looks to me like there is a possibility that's the same handwriting, but maybe not. It may differ just a little bit. We didn't have the length of residence filled in for a hospital because he wasn't in one. This is different than the previous one, which was from some years later. They would vary depending on the year with the information included. Gave his occupation, birth date. Death date is the same as the date the certificate was filed, so no problems there. The handwriting was such that actually this was misfiled this was misindexed, and it took me a while to find it. It should be Foeste, and it looks like an R, so it was filed that way or indexed that way. And the main thing that caught my eye here is they didn't know his father, and they kind of messed up the village in Germany. I later found that was Großlafferty. But the thing that caught my eye was, maiden name of mother, and that actually helped out later. Tice, it's spelled Theiss, but here it's Tyce. So the general analysis of this, it appears to be no problems with it, and it gave me some additional information to follow up on. A few final suggestions, and I hope this has been helpful, first of all, but learn the laws of the jurisdiction and where you find the records. And another thing to always consider is, were the county boundaries the same at the time of your ancestor's birth or death? In which case you may have to look in more than one county. Also, consider you might have to look in adjacent counties just in case. Analyze all the information in a record and resolve anything that conflicts. Dates are notorious for coming up with conflicting information. It may only be a few days, it may be more than that. You have to resolve it. Consider who provided the information. Obviously, on a birth certificate, the individual born did not provide the information because they were the subject of the information. Same way with death certificate, the deceased did not provide the information unless they'd provided their birth record at some point. But if it was the neighbor down the street, you really got to suspect it then. Find the original source always for information. Tombstones are not the original source. It may be all you've got, but if you can, try to find where that came from. Except that the best you may be able to do is to find a date range or year range. And I've given several examples of that through the presentation. And finally, a lot of people will pull these things out of online trees. It's not that I don't like online trees, it's that so many of them are wrong. I use them for clues. They're valuable in that regard. And some of them are spot on, right on the money. But unless they're reliably sourced, which is kind of rare, use them as clues and verify them. As I always say with online trees, don't trust, but verify.
Excellent. Well, Bill, thank you again so much for your time today. And additionally, if you need to catch up on the first parts of this series or would like to rewatch any of those segments, you can view them on demand at the State Historical Society of Missouri's website at shsmo.org. Bill, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.